Hi, I'm Lucy McGowan, and I'm a graduate research fellow at the University of Missouri with the McGowan Center for Entrepreneurship. Today, I'm going to present an idea that I have on how the grounding of social resonance can benefit management literature. So to set the stage for this presentation, today I'm going to be talking about three main um, groups. The first is the primary stakeholders in the organization. That you can consider this the business, the managers, the investors, the employees, people that are directly involved with the business and day-to-day operations. The second is the firm. The firm, think of this as what it produces, the production possibilities that they have. We're going to look at three different actions that the firm takes. And then finally, look at what the literature refers to as secondary stakeholders. Secondary stakeholders are people that do not interact with the business on a day-to-day operations for the production or of the creation of their service, but those who are interested and influenced by what the business does. This group is customers, activists, just bystanders, really anyone that interacts with the output or your business in any way. Today we're going to be talking about a new business, Sake Socks. Sake Socks produces socks that are bright and vibrant colors. So let's learn about what they're doing as they face the business environment and those secondary stakeholders that are in their marketplace. As we navigate through this presentation, you'll see in the bottom right-hand corner the emblems that I just walked through in the last slide. So these are going to tell us and be a guide on what I'm talking about, what groups of what I'm interested in when I'm presenting the theory. So here I'm looking at the stakeholders, both the primary and the secondary stakeholders. So in the literature of the management of organizations, stakeholder theory defines who and what really counts in and around an organization with respect to governance and social responsibility. And when we think about this in two parts, the stakeholder theory is able to say who they are and what matters about what they say. The literature supports that stakeholders use power, urgency, and legitimacy to persuade organizations to act in a way they desire. An example of power would be an investor who has actual decision-making rights in the organization. And so when they have an opinion or a different idea, they are able to use their power that they have in the organization to affect change. Urgency is going to be how urgent the quest of the stakeholder is. Does this have the consequence of a life at hand? How timely does it require us to respond? And what is the pressure of that response? And then finally, legitimacy. This is very easy to see with primary stakeholders when we think about investors or managers who have a part of the business, but in a legitimacy can be more difficult for secondary stakeholders to gain. Secondary stakeholders are also able to get the attention of the manager. In very similar ways that I just described, they're going to use mechanisms that display power, urgency, and legitimacy, but because of their secondary status, they're going to have to use some different mechanisms. This is very easy to see in the social media era where large groups of people can come together to begin to have one collective voice that gives power, urgency, and legitimacy to these secondary stakeholders who would not have that as single people. So we've defined stakeholders as they are, management literature is concerned about them. So now I want to define social resonance. In the literature, social resonance has been defined as the collective societal response to a salient issue. So this is, as I described, in the example I described in the last slide, the secondary stakeholders are able to provide social resonance to the behaviors of organizations, specifically for the discussion of today, the behaviors of organizations. This specifically occurs when society at large reacts to salient issues and organizational behavior. And so what I find interesting about social resonance is that you can be acting in a certain way at time zero, and then an issue through a collective response in society suddenly becomes salient. And so then this issue now has social resonance, whereas at time zero it didn't before. So this varies different from event to event, and typically because of the collectivity of the response, it is fueled by emotionality, commonality, and both of these theories are borrowed from social psychology. So as an event begins to have social resonance and the narrative around the event is crafted in the historical lens that we see, we begin to see other people who may not have found the issue salient begin to empathize and be able to call this a salient issue. As the group builds, that we see that the social resonance builds. And this is all something that we have seen in our daily lives. When we consider the guides that I included in the bottom right hand of this slide, so we're looking at the resonance that we're considering is the behavior of the organization, and this is reaction by the secondary stakeholders. So social resonance is important for this in the study of research and in the real world. Social resonance requires a narrative to be set up, the context of the event that includes historical context, location, and organizational history. While the current definition of social resonance is adequate, the tool of analysis remains ill-defined in the management literature. We are able to identify when an event is socially resonant based on the definitions that I just presented, but there's no way we can look to begin the social media response or the media's response to this event, this organizational behavior that then had a response. But because there's no way to analyze the context that put the organization in the place that they are with the secondary holders' reaction the way it is, the tool to analyze these issues and how they build and how they ultimately affect change for organizations and stakeholders is very difficult to measure. But in the real world, it's important that organizations understand the context of the event and can help organizations understand what went right and what went wrong in retrospect. In the current literature on social resonance, the framing of context is haphazard. I think that the application of this type of methodology or some type of methodology to be able to look at the context as it relates to organizational behavior would help businesses manage in future events how their behavior is viewed by secondary stakeholders. So this question, this concern about why social resonance is important for all three of the people of the organizations, the people I'm talking about, the primary stakeholders that manage the business day to day, that make decisions for the business, the firm and its behavior and as it interacts with the market, and then finally the secondary stakeholders who in this discussion have the power to create resonance. And so the context I'm trying to build around is how do they see the world and how do they see the behavior of the firm? And that question, how do we analyze context, is why I'm here with you guys today, because social ontology allows us to look at the context and why it matters and how we can begin to look into the future to how to manage this better. So I use the grounding and anchoring model presented in Epstein's as the ant trap, because I believe the structure allows rigor to the analysis of organizational conduct that ultimately provides a structure in which management scholars and philosophy scholars can categorize events that register on the social resonance scale. So for the concern of this presentation and the paper, the unit of analysis is the organization. We look at both for the organization, and we're looking at the primary stakeholders as a group and then the secondary stakeholders as a group. The secondary stakeholders are not a part of the organization, but they're the observers of the world and the behavior that they see the firm interacting in. So both pieces are understood to be groups of people. So I wanted these graphics to be a touchstone throughout the presentation to understand how these interact. So sake socks production creates vibrant socks, but that's what they do. That's business as usual. That is firm X does W. Sake socks make socks. But in their production, it's going to be seen that they have some violation in their typical manufacturing practices. For today's concern, I'm suggesting that they use fossil fuels for the production. And so this is a violation to the secondary stakeholder group at large. But previously, this was no concern. There's been a shift in the society that now there is a violation of their behavior. And so the secondary stakeholders have a reaction to this violation, and this causes some social resonance that gives the stakeholders power, urgency, and legitimacy so that the organization and the primary stakeholders begin to listen to their concerns. So firm X does Y is a representation of the violation. They are now viewed differently. As a response to this violation, firm X will do Z. They will respond to the secondary stakeholders. Because the secondary stakeholders have gained power, urgency, and legitimacy in their concern, the stakeholders and the organization will then change the firm behavior. So I'm going to present everything I just said using sake socks as an example in the grounding anchoring model presented by Epstein. So for the current frame at time 1, in the actual world, Sake Socks Firm X is the manufacturer of socks. Sake Socks used historically acceptable practices of production with fossil fuels to make socks. This is framed because it's historically accepted that manufacturing practices are widely accepted. So how they produce is widely accepted, and has been no issue. They've had no change in their demand. There's been no issue. The anchoring of this is that the manufacturing practices of sock producers is accepted as business as usual. So this is firm X does W. They make socks. In time 2, Sake Socks is now considered a bad actor. That is the fact that we're dealing with. Sake Socks is a bad actor. But Sake Socks is now a bad actor only because their historically accepted practices of production with fossil fuels to make socks. Nothing has changed there. They still behave in the same way. The framing has changed. The environmentalists have taken notice of the scientific standards of environmental behavior. The scientific standards are different than historically accepted practices, and anyone who does not comply is considered a bad actor. And so we now have Sake Socks. They are now a violator in this frame, and so they have been redefined, and because there has been enough people have created enough power, urgency, and legitimacy in their concern. This is anchored because there's extensive scientific research, and it has been established that carbon emissions must be reduced. This can be achieved by the reduction of production with fossil fuels. And so it's this use of fossil fuels that now categorizes Sake Socks as a bad actor. And this violation gets the attention of the primary stakeholders. And so now, because they have been given a new social fact in who they are, we are going to look at their response. So in the final frame, Sake Socks is an environmentally conscious sock manufacturer. So they have had some response. And here I model that the Sake Socks now adheres to the manufacturer principles accepted and supported by the environmentalist community. And so they're now no longer a bad actor because they have taken notice of the scientific standards of environmental behavior and have adhered to them. And so now, in response to the violation, because of the power, the urgency, and legitimacy that the secondary stakeholders created through the framing and the anchoring of their proposition, Sake Socks has now responded, and we're able to see the shift in how Sake Socks has remained a sock manufacturer the whole time. And really nothing has shifted in their manufacturing productions in the first 2 points. But there was this coalescence of communication, so that event became socially resonant enough that sake socks was able to change their behavior. So this work is meaningful because in the management literature, we don't use grounding and framing principles or models. There is no place to create a mechanism or framework to consider context and how a small shift can change firm behavior. But ultimately, as I worked through these models to understand what was really happening, I identified that social resonance of an event is a direct measure of the amount of attention primary stakeholders are giving to the reactions of second stakeholders of an organizational event. And I think that this is a better definition of what social resonance is when we consider how the interactions are happening across these boundaries of the three people, right? With the primary stakeholders, the firm and the business that they do, and the secondary stakeholders. Ultimately, I'm thrilled with the use of social ontology methods and theories to be able to understand better what's happening in organizational behavior and to be able to articulate, to identify very clearly that the attention is the issue. And so I'm excited to continue to apply these ideas and these concepts as I look at organizational behavior in the market. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for the opportunity to present, and I look forward to continuing the discussion and learning from the experts, from you guys, on how I could improve this model. Please reach out to me at lmcgowan@mail.missouri.edu if you have any questions or ideas or would like to collaborate. I'm looking forward to getting to know you all and interact in this strange time. Thank you so much.